Smallmouth bass are not largemouths. There's no question about it. They're far and away more mobile, fish that are a lot more transient as a whole. They really are. In some cases, a lot of understanding the personality of a smallmouth would be a lot closer to a walleye than a largemouth for a couple of different reasons. They feed on a lot wider or diverse varied types of foods. They'll go out and swim and suspend out in open water. By the same token, you'll catch those really big 5-pounders in the back ends of a slop bay on one boulder pile a mile away from anywhere where it's any deeper than 6 foot of water, way in the back ends of the bays. That's a mainstream presentation for us to catch really big smallmouth bass on Lake of the Woods. Our key pattern, go find the biggest boulder in the back end of the bay. That's for when you're really hunting horses. You meet really big ones, that's where we're gonna go. But we'll advance a little bit farther. The location factor, the use of your electronics to methodically comb water. These are fabulous tools. As these guys had stated, they talked about the use of electronics mapping programs. I can't even overstate the value of these on the water in the fish finding process. It really is. They're just amazing tools. Last but not least, the presentation factor, the experimentation with the baits in your tackle box. Let's look at the seasonal movement of smallmouth bass. And the biggest thing is, how many people actually are all bass fishermen here, or do we have some walleye fishermen in here and pan fishermen? Or we do have some. But the basic nature and the seasonal movement of almost all warm water species of fish is the same. And I'm going to go through this really quickly. I'm going to go through 4 slides and just speed troll through this, and you'll understand why when I get to the last slide. Seasonal, right now we're in the winter period. The majority of smallmouth bass in our lakes right here at this point in time are congregated in an area called the wintering area. There are often some deep water access off these big expansive flats, and there's tremendous schools of fish. These schools of fish are, in some cases, depending on the body of water you're in, there's hundreds of them. Hundreds and hundreds of fish. This is the winter collection area. It could be in a depth of anywhere between 15 and 45 foot of water. Let's move a little bit farther forward. Spring, the fish move up into the shallow bays. Everybody sort of knows in this audience who actually fish smallmouth bass where they spawn at. They're going to spawn on these back shallow water flats. It could be marl bottom, it could be bulrushes, it could be isolated rock piles with a big sand flats in between them. That's perfect habitat for smallmouth bass in spring. Let's advance a little bit farther. I'm going to move into the summer pattern. We're going to do this quickly, and the reason why will become very apparent to you. In summer, the big main lake points, big flats, sunken islands are the critical food shelves. This is where the food is the primary factor that dictates the seasonal movements of all freshwater fish. Food. We'll get to food in a second too. But the biggest thing is the understanding that these are the big food shelves. That's very easy. Everybody sort of knows that. These food shelves could be sand, it could be rock, it could be weed beds. It's relatively simple. We'll jump one step forward. In fall, these fish start to drain off, and they really concentrate on the sharp drop-offs off these flats. Now this is where I really wanted to get the last slide. When you look at a seasonal basis, where were they? All over the lake. At some point in time, even when on a relatively small body of water, these fish were in spring, early season. As soon as the ice came off the lake, I could have caught them back up on these shallow flats in 3-4 foot of water. In summer, they're moving out onto these main lake points. And so these fish, every time you put your boat in the water, you have to realize seasonally, most of the fish in a given population are in a relatively small section of the lake, which tells you, you have to go look for them. You have to use your electronics and methodically go experiment somewhere around the lake. This is reality though. This is a relatively small body of water. This is where we're going to go fishing at. It's a little bit easier on that small lake than when all of a sudden this is only 10-mile section of the lake. Realistically, spring, summer, fall. Spring, you're going to start in here, the shallow backwater channels. Fall, I might start on the outside peripheral and go in. Midsummer, it gets a little bit more complex because they can be anywhere in between. You know what I mean? But this is just gives you the general idea of where you could potentially get to. I'm going to move a little bit more farther forward here, and you're going to see this. What this is actually at the back end of the bay on Rainy Lake. It's called Cormorant Bay. Like, if you're familiar with Rainy Lake, this is like a famous smallmouth bass spot. It's absolutely an unbelievable fishery. And what these GPS coordinates represent are fish. This is what the practice period when I was practicing a tournament 2 years ago there. I found this school of fish, and what it is, it's like a cloud. These smallmouth bass move on each one of, this is the back end of the bay, on each one of these isolated rock piles back there, there's about 4 or 5 fish on each one of those rock piles. These fish move, like as we said before, largemouth bass versus smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass in a lot of cases move like walleyes. They move like a big cloud like this, and they're moving. And what I did here is actually, when we're practicing for a tournament, what we'll do is, intermittently skip down the lake. We're on a big complex body of water. I'll move in like half-mile intervals. In spring or early season, I would start at the back end of the bay. If it was later in the summer or fall, I'd start on the outside of the bay, and you start intermittently jumping at half-mile intervals. And what you're trying to do is to fall into one of these schools of fish. Once I isolate where there's some fish at, I would move backward and forward from that area, trying to analyze where the perimeter of the school of fish is. Now I'm going to go one step farther in. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look. Fish in front of the school and know all the structures around the fish, they're going to move. Now, for many of you who fish smallmouths, and these guys said the same thing, many times you will come back and you will say, well, I had all these fish all over these spots. What happened to them? The fact of the matter is, it's really intriguing what happened to them. Food. Food is the primary factor that determines the location of fish in any given body of water. Smallmouth bass feed on a wide variety of different forages. Perch. Perch are a huge thing, and a lot of times if the fourth is chained, or in some of these, there must be some type of food in them weed beds, and most of the time, like in our lakes, it's small perch. The fish feed heavily on them. In this particular lake, we have a tremendous amount of crayfish. We also have not only perch and crayfish, we have rainbow smelt, cisco, and tullibees. And guess which ones they like to feed on? They like to feed on all of them. And then last but not least, bugs. We had in June up in our area, or in May, and actually all throughout the summer months, we have intermittent bug hatches. And it's amazing on how this school of fish will rove around, this whole population of fish will rove around grazing on those food opportunities. They're going to wherever the best restaurants are in that system at that given point in time. That's what they do. That's what they know. They're the prisoners of the environment they live in. The intriguing thing is, I'll share something with you about this. I won some tournaments on this lake, actually a couple of them. The interesting thing is, do you know what? In practice, I found them here. You know where I won the tournament at? Off the tips of these rock piles out here. It was the same school of fish, and it was 4 days later. And it was the same school of fish, I guarantee you. Those fish moved that far. You'll look at me and say, that's really egotistical. You're fishing different fish. No, I wasn't. No. These fish in here, these were actually post-spawn big females. And we followed these fish because my brother was so insistent that we keep on literally track these fish. And how they bred every day of practice, we saw these fish were starting to drain out, all the big females out of the back end of this bay. And these fish all of a sudden skipping. One day they're out in the peripheral points. By the end of the tournament, we actually caught the fish. We caught them off the top of 15-foot humps out here. This section of water is about 1.5 miles of water, a 2-mile section of water. But it goes to show you something about the understanding of actually how fast these fish can move. In some systems, I know the lakes you're in In some cases, if there's those shallow water, dirty water lakes, they might not be doing that. You're fishing Simcoe and these other bodies of water, that's a whole different story. Those fish are extraordinarily mobile. I know I've actually fished a tournament last year on Lake Sinclair, and it was just amazing. I had never been on Lake Sinclair before. That is a cool lake. And it's the same thing. You are fishing. I know Larry Nixon ended up winning the tournament, and I watched him and Shin Fukai actually take, I don't know, the third and first, and they're fishing about two blocks from me on the end of the dumping grounds, and watch them catching their fish. But it just goes to show you what Larry had stated. It really simple. He says these fish, what you have to do, they're moving so much, and it's staying on top of the fish. What you are doing is hunting smallmouths. Largemouth bass are completely different. Largemouth bass, like what Pete was talking about, so many times I'll come back and I'll find a deep weed edge where those bass are, and I put a GPS coordinate. I could come back there for 2 weeks in a row, 3 weeks in a row, flip into that weed clump, and guess what? I'm gonna get bit. These fish here, that isn't what's gonna happen, not for smallmouth bass. These fish are far and away a lot more mobile. One thing I'm gonna step a little bit farther forward, and what we're gonna do is look at it. This is like a blow up of a little section of water. And you can see what I have here is some GPS coordinates. When I fished through this area, what I did is I just dropped coordinates down wherever I caught a fish. You'll notice that there's a bunch of other really nice little spots. There's a 4-foot hump here, a bunch of rocks out here, some spots here. If I was to come fishing through here in this tournament, I definitely would go and fish all of these other spots, because I know what happened. What it is this school of fish, there's a number of different what we term as feeding stations. They're key spots where the fish, when they get actively feeding, they will move up onto. On any underwater structure, there's specific things there. It could be isolated boulders, it could be a weed to rock transition, it could be a clump of cabbage, it could be a wide variety of different, these little spots where these fish live. When they're inactive, they might drop off a little bit deeper, but when they feed, they move up to a really specific location to feed. But the thing is, that's what I was saying. If I was to fish in a tournament fishing scenario, in a lot of anglers who don't fish tournaments, it doesn't make any difference. You're still using the same approach. Just because I didn't catch them there yesterday, I would still go fish all these alternate spots. What I'm saying, you fish areas versus spots. That's what's a lot different when you're fishing largemouth bass versus smallmouth bass. At least in my estimation, a lot of times what I'm sharing with you is the way I go about fishing. Each one of you have to develop your own style of fishing, garner confidence in your logic and locational strategy and how you move out on the water. But the biggest thing is what I wanted to emphasize here for any different species of fish is your just willingness to move around and experiment. Use your depth finder to its maximum potential. In many cases, you can see that there's food in the water. You can see it. There's vast areas. We go back up a couple of slides when you looked at that 10-mile section of the lake. The intriguing thing is I fish a tournament up on Lake of the Woods. We fished it for like 10 years straight, the Canadian Bass International. I actually won it a couple of different times, but there was one section of the lake. It's on the north end of the Alanu Peninsula. It's absolutely the finest smallmouth bass fishery in the planet. You would drive through this and you'd say it's unbelievable. Mazes of rock piles, weed beds, sand points, transitions. You look through here for 5 years in a row. Every time Al and I came up in practice period, we'd wander through the lake and we'd have to go back up to the Wake Welcome Channel, cruise and look through the spots. 5 years in a row, there's no fish there. 6th year we show up, guess what? They're there. Finally, they showed up. That's what I'm saying. Those fish are grazing around in these systems, particularly when you're blessed to fish these really big bodies of water like that. Just because the fish weren't there one year doesn't mean they're not going to be there the next year. It doesn't. Those fish are moving around based on the available food in the system. That's what they're doing. What's next here? This is sort of an interesting, this is sort of like an addendum to the last concept. And it's a little bit of a different scenario here. And what this is more of a deeper water access point here. And this is really intriguing. This is another section of the lake, but you'll notice we have a lot deeper water, a lot closer to shallow water. This is something that I've seen this happen on this spot a lot. and it's sort of interesting. What these coordinates represent are little clumps of red cabbage. We get these little clumps of red cabbage at certain times of the year on these lakes, whether it be Lake of the Woods and Rainy Lake. And do we have red cabbage in these lakes here? Broadleaf red cabbage. At certain times of the year, it's the weirdest thing in the world. For some reason, smallmouth bass, it's amazing. It's absolutely stunning. These are clumps of red cabbage. They're like not that big between us and the gentleman here, right out in front. Little clumps of it. And they're just staggered in different places. Every red clump or red cabbage clump, if you were to throw a jig over there, you will catch a smallmouth bass. The interesting thing is all these coordinates represent those red cabbage patches. Actually, this runs for another half mile down the right bank. But the thing is, if you have a dramatic weather temperature change or a warming change, I might catch this exact same fish in two different areas. If it was really warm and stable, when you get warm and stable weather conditions, a lot of times what happens is crayfish move up on tops of the rocks. Smallmouth know that. It gets warm and stable, smallmouth move up on top of the rocks and feed on crawdads. You get a really adverse weather conditions, a cold front comes through, in conditions, everybody says, what happens? The cold front conditions came through. What happened, gentlemen?
Fish disappeared.
They disappeared. You know what? A lot of people say the fish stopped biting. I'm telling you, I don't think they stopped biting. I think they moved somewhere else. And do you know why they moved somewhere else? They came out here and started feeding on deep water forage. All of a sudden you have a thermocline. We're fishing in midsummer. The thermocline's at 15 or 20 foot down. All of a sudden you have a big storm front come through. It disrupts the lake. The wind shakes up the lake, and all of a sudden that deep water forage now can move shallow. So all of a sudden, all these smallmouth bass that I could catch on top water on these boulders, shallow boulders, or on these, throw jigs into these cabbage patches, do you know where they're at now? Suspended out here and feeding in deep water. And sometimes you pull up and you look at this spot here, you know where all these fish move to? To the tip of that 11-foot point, or this 14-foot hump. All those fish, all of a sudden, when they move shallow, this is a concept. When they move shallow, the fish spread out. It's like an accordion. When they move deeper, you get this shrink down, and they all group together. So when they move shallow, they spread out. When they move down, so the biggest thing is when you find them in deep water, obviously you get what? You get bigger schools of fish, which it can help in tournament fishing, I can guarantee you that. You find them big schools, and you guys, I know the waters you fish, you're blessed in the fact that when you find them, these are really tremendous schools of fish. Let's go to the next level. That's what I was talking about, food availability, crayfish, minnows, perch, smelt, ciscos, bug catches, weather, and we sort of went through each one of them, and I tried to, it's just understanding a concept in angling, because I don't want to say, the weather happens and the fish do this, or something happens, and the more you know about angling, you take all those theories and you just throw them out the door. You know what I mean? That's a weird thing. That's what makes angling really interesting. The more you know about it, the more you realize the variables and how these different things can change.